Hi, this is Paul with the Oaken Knight. Let's talk about Antietam, the recently released game by Worthington as an old school war game. And that it is. It is very recognizably similar to games that have gone before and is very much in that vein, but with a new twist. So let's take a look and see what we're dealing with here. And as you might expect, as an old school war game, it is not doing some of the new things that seem to be standard these days, such as chit pulls. There are no chit pulls in this game. This is an old school you turn, me turn sort of game. Let's take a look and see how they did in a thumbnail review format. First thing to understand is that this is indeed an old school war game because it is a direct descendant of Chickamauga River of Death and Gettysburg High Tide of the Confederacy, both published by Phoenix Enterprises Limited in the early 1980s. When this game arrived, I could almost play the game based on my memory of having played these two older games without even reading the rules. It's that close. And even with that, all these games are direct descendants from Richard Berg's design, Terrible Swift Sword, Great Battles of the American Civil War. They really are something very close to a brigade-level representation of what Terrible Swift Sword would have been had it been a brigade-level game instead of a regimental-level game. Let's just start with the backbone of the game, the sequence of play, and you'll kind of see what I'm talking about. First thing that occurs is a command phase where you're basically checking command ranges. Second thing is an organization phase where you can do things like build entrenchments and such, none of which occur at the Battle of Antietam, so you can essentially skip this phase. Offensive artillery fire, the phasing player with their artillery can go ahead and shoot. Then the phasing player moves. Then there's defensive fire, and then offensive fire, and then finally rally. Players change roles in the second half of the turn and mix and repeat. That's it. That is the sequence of play. Now, one of the things that is notable by its absence, that is absolutely part of Terrible Swift Sword and the Chickamauga and High Tide games that I mentioned earlier, is a melee phase. This game does not have a melee phase, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit in a few minutes. I think that changes things a bit. All right, I guess what I want to do is give you a quick 3-up, 3-down opinion of the game. What are the strong points, what are the weak points, and then you can go ahead and do whatever research you want to and decide whether this is a game you want to pick up or not. And as usual, I like to talk about the good stuff first. So on the positive side, the game is beautiful. The game map, it comes on a hardbound game map. Very beautifully done. The terrain textures are very nice, very clear. No mystery as far as what's in each and every one of the hexes. Very easy and natural colors, tans and greens that are all look very nice together. Everything is sharp, crisp, very well done, lovely game map. The counters are large and functional. Not only that, they also have that kind of almost textured feel to them. When you run your fingers across them, you can just kind of feel the little bit of texture that's left from after the printing. Extremely nicely done. And best of all, these counters are mounted in counter racks that are the counters don't even touch each other in the rack. They're all individually punched out. They come pre-rounded. They're something, I think they're 5/8 of an inch. I'd have to measure, but they're nice, big, beautiful counters. Everything is very visible. Possible some people with eyesight issues, with color blindness, and I have a friend who has that, so this is something I'm used to, might have a problem with the division designations. It's the usual colored stripe at the top of the counter. But aside from that, I think that the counters are beautiful. And not only that, they punch out of their holding racks just absolutely beautiful. You don't have to do any kind of cleanup on them. The counters all come out with rounded corners. There's no marks to speak of at the midpoint of the various four sides. Everything comes out. I didn't really have to do anything to clean up these counters. I would say the most possibly you need to do is a light touch with an X-Acto knife if something didn't quite come out right. But that's it. By and large, the counters are going to absolutely come out perfect, beautiful. You're not going to be spending 3 hours with your counter puncher rounding the corners. Absolutely, you're not going to have to do that. So the first thumbs up on the game would be the base components are very nicely done. Very nicely done. Second positive, easy setup. Unlike a Gettysburg game where basically hardly anything starts on the map, you do have to do a setup. But the individual counters that are starting on the map have the hex numbers printed on them. Some people don't like that. Some people do. For a game like this, it's great. I mean, if it just speeds the setup, and I think it's a non-issue. If I guess if you don't like that enough or you don't want to buy the game, that's entirely up to you. But I think most people are going to really like this, and the numbers that are on the counters, you're not going to see them after you're playing the game. You're not going to notice them. They're subtle enough for it's absolutely not a non-issue as far as I can tell. The third thing that I like about the game, it's playable, playable, playable. The scenarios are well laid out. The number of counters on the map are by no means, they're substantial, but by no means overwhelming. The Union had a lot of troops there. They were pretty big. They had lots of brigades. But again, since you have to choose who's active, you're not using all of them all at the same time as a general rule. The Confederates are trying to plug the gaps with their smaller forces. They have fewer and smaller, but they have some very good troops that are highly effective, high morale, not likely to run. The game is very playable in a single sitting. Certainly, as a scenario, you could knock this off in an afternoon and have time left over. I think the estimate from the publisher is about 2 hours. For people who've played before, could very well be right. They say about 6 hours for the campaign. That might be a little optimistic, but when I play, I take my time. So maybe it's just me or just me and the people I play with. I never seem to be able to play as fast as the box says it should, but your mileage will vary. The rules themselves are very well written. Not perfectly written, but they're well written. The Antietam game is the first installment of a series. So the rules are organized as series rules plus scenario rules, so it's just two booklets, and it's you can you can spend an hour on these booklets and be playing the game, or at least setting up the game and playing in another 20 minutes after that. I mean, the main rule book is something about 8 pages. The scenario book is maybe about 4 or 5 pages, and a lot of that is, like in the scenario book, I think maybe there's one more page of rules, and you pick one of the 4 scenarios, and you read some scenario stuff, and you're playing. Battle of Antietam really divides itself into 3 smaller battles that were fought serially. And so the scenarios are designed around that concept, and then you have a full battle game as you might expect and hope. One of the key issues in any game covering Battle of Antietam is how to handle McClellan. And the McClellan rule in this game is actually, like everything else, is easy. You are limited to activating 2 corps. That's the McClellan rule. That's the heart of the McClellan rule. You can only activate 2 corps. Only 2 corps can move. However, if you are already in contact, you can shoot. If you're a non-active corps, you can take ranged artillery fire. All infantry fire is at range 1 and range 1 only. So if you are adjacent to an enemy unit, you still get to shoot. You still get to defend yourself, even if you're not active. At the start of every turn, one of the decisions the Union player is going to have to make is which are the 2 active corps right now. Do you want to focus on having 2 and only 2 attacking? Do you want to be mixing in other corps, possibly trying to use your 2 activations to manage 3 or even 4 corps at some level of effectiveness? That's entirely up to you to explore and to see what you can get work as someone who's trying to play the game. So bottom line is that the McClellan rule is actually pretty sensible for what is a relatively simple war game. One caveat is that there are 3 victory objectives on the map: the Dunker Church, the Sunken Road, and the Confederate empty area. For each one of those you capture as a Union, you get to activate an additional corps. So success begets more success. McClellan thought he was being successful. Quite possibly he would be more aggressive. And that's the way this game flows, is that if McClellan starts being successful, you will start getting more corps activations and even more chances of being even more successful. The McClellan rule is essential in any Antietam game, and I think they did a pretty good job here. I have no issues with that at all. So those are the three things that I really like about the game. Again, it's the physical components for the primary components of the game, easy setup, very clean rules, 8 pages plus a couple pages of scenario rules, and you're playing the game. And finally, the general playability of the game itself. Well, how long did it take me to explain the sequence of play? About a minute. I mean, it's not much more complicated than that. If you've played the Chickamauga game, the High Tide of the Confederacy game, you almost know how to play this game already. Okay, so let's talk about some of the negative stuff. All right, and there are negative stuff, just like with anything. And so let's talk about that just a little bit. On the negative side, I'm going to put components on the negative side. I think that the rules are actually written on kind of paper. It's kind of glossy, but I think it's kind of thin. It's not what I would expect to get from a GMT or a Compass Games. Their rule books are becoming, well, GMT's always been good, and Compass is really coming on strong with the quality of what they publish. The books are on kind of flimsy sort of paper. I don't especially like it. And they also included a chain of command chart that's it's a chain of command chart showing the organizations of both armies. Unfortunately, they put the Union on one side of this double width chart, so it's like 2 pages but joined together. You flip it and you got the Confederates. Okay, so to me, either you want to put two of them in there or none of them in there. I don't know. It just doesn't seem to be, putting one of them in there when you're playing against somebody, they're going to want to have their chart. Well, you don't have that. Unless you go, what I did, you go to your color copier, you make the copies, you go to your lamination machine, you laminate it, and then you're fine. But the way it comes out of the box, you're probably going to want to deal with it. It's on the same kind of flimsy sort of paper the rule book is written on, and it could have been better done. Okay. Another part of the components that I didn't like is that they did not produce a sequence of play chart. To me, a sequence of play chart showing the various phases that happen and maybe a one or two liner by each of them, that is like standard. Okay, that's like got to be there. It's kind of buried halfway through the series rules. Admittedly, it's like about an 8 page series rule book. It's not a tome, but it's nowhere that is just like you can pick it up, you put it one by you put one by your buddy, and you're good. In fact, it's even printed in such a way that it's kind of printed across the column break in the rule book, so it's not really something you can just copy. And you'd want to retype it by hand and make your own charts. And it's clearly that could have been done better. At a barest minimum, it could have been printed on the back of the rule book, the sequence of play. It was not. You're going to have to do something, especially if you're having a friend over who is less familiar with the game. It's something that it should have been there. It wasn't there. You'll have to make your own. Then there's the decision not to have a melee phase. Now, this one, I'm scratching my head a little bit. Let me read in the designer's notes. The designer has something to say. Let me just read it to you. And they say that melee combat has always been considered a necessary evil in Civil War games. We removed it from play as the goal in most attacks was to drive the defender off a key piece of ground or destroy them. By allowing the defender to fire and results to be applied to the attacker, and then the attacker to fire and the results applied, the same effect is reached. The attacker can advance into the defender vacated hex. And then he just gets, for withdrawal fire, he just says, I hate withdrawal fire and thought it was tedious and pointless. So I think both are fairly thin explanations as to why these should be removed from the game. Now, the removing withdrawal fire does not, I don't think, has a big effect on the game, so I don't think that's as big a deal. The Zocs are pretty much rigid, so you're really just leaving zones of control, which this game has, all the way around. It does not have flanks. It does not have rear. It does. If you attack from 3 hex sides, there is a bonus for that, calling it a flank. But really, there's not the usual. Okay, there's the 3 front hex sides. There's 2 flank hex sides and 1 rear hex side. That is not in this game. Okay, but removing withdrawal fire, I really don't think they've lost too much. So I think that's an okay decision. That's certainly, if you want to take an already uncomplicated game, which is what the Chickamauga and Gettysburg high tide games were, that's okay. I don't think that's an issue. But with removing melee combat, how else are you going to focus an attack on an objective? The only other thing you can do is to kind of walk up as far as you can, as far as the Zox will allow you to, and then just grind away. It all comes down to grinding away. You're not charging, you're not focusing your effort as much as directly and as decisively on taking Cemetery Hill or taking Little Round Top. You'll have to simply buck up and just trade fires, and hopefully the guy in the critical hex will eventually break and leave. And if he does that, and you made him break on your offensive fire, then you get to walk in. If you made him break on your defensive fire, sorry, you don't get to walk in right away. But still, you don't have as much. You don't get to feel like you're pushing them off the hill. You're kind of grinding on each other, and sooner or later somebody's going to decide not to be there. Now, I do understand what he's saying about basically about the casualties in the Chickamauga and River of Death and High Tide of the Confederacy games. Melees were very high casualty affairs. And if you had players who really insisted on doing one after the other after the next, regardless of the situation, you'd be blowing out your army. You'd be burning out your army very quickly, I think. But as a judicious tool to attack and take key objectives, I think it was a very useful tool to have in your toolbox. And if intelligently used, could make all the difference. If not used intelligently, it could kill you. So I don't know. I don't think the answer was necessarily to take that tool out of the toolbox. I mean, I'll give you an example. In the older games, to say, okay, I want to melee. We had our offensive and defensive fire. Now I say, I want to melee this hex. Okay, defender gets free shots. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, so if you hang around, great. Then you get to have your melee. You're in the melee. You're rolling more. Boom, boom, boom. Both sides on the attrition table as far as causing hits to one another, and making morale checks. If the attacker, well, if the defender blows a morale check, the unit is leaving the hex. Attacker wins, yay. If the attacker, however, blows the morale check, if he has taken over 50% casualty and is on the reverse side of his counter, then the unit just picks up. It just blows up. So let's say you had a 16-point unit, 1,600-man brigade, walk into a melee, and because nobody broke, maybe you went 3 rounds of melee, nobody broke, boom, 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 all these shots happening. Now you're a 7. Okay, you're less than half. You're going to have, in the older games, you'd have a lower morale. You would roll. If you blew that roll, all 7 points that were left over would immediately die. Very brutal, very brutal. And so if you were attacking intelligently, you would only do it if you had an advantage you could really, wrap your arms around. If you were doing it even up, well, you're kind of deserving what you get. You're going to get a grinding melee, and if you lose it, you may lose a lot of steps. You may lose the entire unit or units going in. On the defender side, if the defender was an artillery unit, if he blew his morale, likewise he would pick up and exit the game with 100% casualties. So, as the rules were written in the Phoenix games, yes, the melee was possibly too many casualties. But that's not a reason not to put melee in the game. It's a reason to, since you're redoing the game, to rewrite the rule, not to eliminate the rule. So I think it may be that people notice that difference. These games came from the terrible Swift Sword system, as I mentioned. That game had melees in it. All its progeny had melees in it. The brigade level ones that spun off from it had melees in it. I'm not sure why this should not have melees in it. I think it should in some form, even if it's a milder form than what was done before. All right, that is my second down. My third one is simply, the casualty record. Every time you take a hit, you have these counters, units, tens, hundreds. You have to remember to slide the casualty counters. Every time your units take a hit, I took 2 hits. Okay, I got to slide the casualty marker by 2. Then I got to mark the 2 hits on the unit involved. It's a simple matter using these spin wheel counters that have the numbers from, I think, 1 to 24. So you have 3 different counters, each double-sided, each having 4 different sides. So each counter can represent 8 different levels of strength, and there's 3 different types of counters. So you can go from 1 to 24. So it's not a big deal to do that, since there's very little stacking in the game. Only 1 brigade per hex, so you can have that plus a strength marker, possibly a leader. If it's cavalry, you could have a dismounted marker. But that's about it. So even when units are all bucked up against each other, and most of the time they are, it's still not going to be a big deal as far as density. And you have these big, beautiful, nicely thick, rounded corner counters that are not going to be snagging on each other as you pick them up and see what the strength point is underneath. So I think all of that is as good as it can be in a board game format. And so it's a non-issue. But maintaining the casualty record, you just got to remember to do it. You take a hit, you got to mark, you got to slide the counter on the game map to say how many total hits has your army taken, and then mark it on the brigade, and then do your morale check, and that's what you do each and every time. The game, general thoughts about it. If you like the Civil War and you are looking for something at the lower complexity level, and I would say, let's say on the 10-point scale, I would put this at about a 3. Say maybe advanced beginner, I would call it. If you've sat down with somebody who's never played a game before, it possibly could be a little too much. But if this is an adult, rather than a kid, I think that yeah, you could explain it, you could demonstrate it, they could play. I don't think it's that hard. So, I mean, the issue is not the difficulty. The issue, if there is one, is simply game comes down to lining your units up against each other and banging away. You're going up and down the line a lot of times. You defensive fire, you start at one end of the line, you count factors, you shoot. You do the result. You go to the next one, you count the factors, you shoot. And you're doing that again, up the line for, say, defensive fire. Next phase is offensive fire. You start at the end of the line again. You count the factors. You look at the counter underneath, the guy you're shooting with, and you shoot. And you go to the next guy and you shoot. And you go to the next guy and you shoot. You resolve the hits by, like I say, marking them on the map, marking one to the counter, doing the morale rolls. So in that sense, it's possibly a little repetitive that some people may not appreciate, but that is the nature of battle games such as this, either Civil War or Napoleonics, or it's a battlefield attrition, and so there's going to be a lot of that going on. So if that doesn't bother you, if you want a game that you can pick up and play and finish the same day, or very comfortably in 2 settings, if you're solitairing it, this is going to be quite possibly a very nice system to use. It's the first one, so we gotta give these guys a pat on the back, a little break of our comments that are saying it may not be the perfect game. That's okay. It's the first one out of the chute. The next one is going to be Shiloh, as I understand, which I would really look forward to. Battle of Shiloh is a fantastic gamer's battlefield situation for wargaming. It's a very interesting battle, and I would expect that it's going to produce a great game at this level of complexity. All right, well, that is what I've got to say. Again, this is just a thumbnail review, more than an unboxing, less than maybe a detailed review, and certainly less than a playthrough. But I want to give you a little idea of what goes on with this game in the beginnings of this brand new system that Worthington Games is producing. And this is Paul with the Oka Knight, wishing you some happy times at your gaming table and a pleasant evening. Bye-bye.